acknowledge the rightful owners of the lands on which CSU campuses reside, the Wiradjuri, the Ngunnawal, the Biripi, the Gundungara peoples of New South Wales and beyond. I pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, for they are the custodians of the knowledges of the lands on which CSU campuses reside. I'm Susan Milchek, and I welcome you here this afternoon to this public presentation by Associate Professor Leonie Pihama from New Zealand. There are many things that make up and define Leonie, and she will speak to those throughout her presentation. She's here with us on behalf of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Faculty of Arts and Education, and of course CSU University and all of our schools from throughout the university, and our Wiradjuri friends in the community. Leonie is here also as the director of the Kotahi Research Centre from Waikato University. Without further ado, I give you Leonie Pihama. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou tūtahi, mihi tēnei kia koutou kua hui hui mai nei I runga I te karanga o te wā. Mihi ki te hau kāinga, te iwi Wiradjuri, nā koutou mātou I manaaki I tiaki I tēnei rangi, I tēnei ahi pō, no reira tēnei te mihi. He mihi hoki ki a koutou ki te whanaunga o tauranga moana tēnei te mihi atu. Kia tātou katoa I hui hui mai tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I just want to add my appreciation to the people of this country, of this land, to the Wiradjuri nation here in Bathurst, and to those who cared for me and hosted me as well in Wagga Wagga, and in a very short time, the really strong relationships I feel that we've connected with and built during this visit. Yeah, and it's a real pleasure and honour to be here from Aotearoa and to be having these kind of nation-to-nation relationships and dialogues and conversations and engagements, and also in terms of our university relationships and our research relationships. And so I do want to acknowledge Susan from, who is a relation from Aotearoa, from home, just up the road from one of my own tribal territories in Tauranga, and the relationship that I have, with Susan through other relations. So Susan's niece is actually my PA in our institution, so we've got a long-term relationship as well as other whānau, other relations that I work with in terms of their connections with Susan, but also just generally to the hosting that I've had both in Wagga Wagga and here over these past few days has been really exceptional in terms of hosting, because for our people, as with many Indigenous people, how you host people is really important. How you care for people and how you feed people on all levels, food for thought, food for the body, food for the spirit, how we feed each other in terms of connectedness, and how what grows and evolves from that is a whole range of future relationships. I do really want to acknowledge that and acknowledge the ancestors, Wiradjuri ancestors of this country, past, present and future, and to all of the Wiradjuri people who have cared for me, who are the embodiment of ancestors and other ancestors of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So I wanted to really just connect myself in terms of my own whakapapa, my own tribal connections, in terms of being here. And before going on to talk a little bit about a project that I've been really fortunate to be a part of with a very big community team as a part of a program of Māori health research that was led by a Māori health organisation, community-based research institute, Te Whao Te Ao, based in Wanganui, which is in the west coast of Te Ika Maui, the fish of Maui, which is known commonly as the North Island. So for those of you who come to Aotearoa and you know it as New Zealand, we have many names for the islands, and Te Ika Maui is the northernmost island. And that project was focused on notions of historical and colonial trauma, the impact of, and thinking about healing of. So both understanding historical and colonial trauma and thinking around the pathways to healing. And the word whakarau o the tangata is around, the process of healing people. So I'm from I have two solid tribal connections, iwi connections, to Waikato Tainui and to Taranaki. So this mountain, Taranaki, is the mountain that I've been born and raised under. It is an ancestor, so it's an ancestral connection we have to this mountain. And then on the right is Karioi Maunga, which is a mountain going toward the coast of Waikato Tainui of the Hamilton region. And so these are our connections to, people have been talking about place-based relationships and connection and being on country. These connections are really what inform us and have really informed how I think about the world and how we're in relationship with all things around us at all times. So the awa, or the connections I have to rivers, is on the left-hand side is the Waitara River, and so actually our family house is kind of in here. So that's where I was born and raised, and I spend even now a lot of my adult time going between the university where I work and Waikato tribal territory, and here it's about 3.5 hours, but the same from Wagga Wagga to here. So that drive was really great for me yesterday. But this river, Waitara, is one of the rivers which I connect to, and this is the Waikato River. So both of my tribal, my iwi connections are very much connected to mountain and very much connected to river. But we're also a coastal people, so I have these multiple influences in my life in terms of the environment, that what we call the taiao, the connections to the environmental world around us. And so this is Waitara, this is the beach around which you will have seen at the mouth of the river. And this sea, we refer to this ocean, ngā tai o rehua, this sea, and this sea is called generally the Tasman Sea. Yep. And this is Whaingaroa Harbour and Sea, and it's to the west coast of Waikato, and it's often referred to as Raglan. So, the influences of my life are really very, in terms of the environment that I've been raised in and what I know, and the connection to place or connection to country, the connection to tribal territory, really are a combination of these things of land, of mountain, of river, of sea. And it's important for us to think about that and the healing process, because what it does is it gives us pathways for healing that are very similar across Māori nation or across Māori people, but also very different in terms of the environmental spaces that we go to for healing. So if you're a river person without a coast, you have a different relationship to the land, say, than if you're a lake person. So often we talk about land still in a very kind of abstracted way, but actually it's really informing of who we are and our identity and how we might think about, well, both our history, so the impact of our history and why certain areas were invaded perhaps earlier than others because of what the geography and the land offered, but also in terms of how we might progress and move toward healing that's really grounded in where we are and where we're from and being on the land. And the other, another significant influence in terms of my positioning in the work. So I talk a lot about positionality as a Māori woman researcher, as a Māori scholarship, about being very clear about how I position and locate myself in relationship to the work that we do, but also the kind of theoretical frameworks and the methodological frameworks and the methods that I use. And so we have a treaty, and there's a lot of discussion around treaties here, or the potential for treaties here. And so this is up at Waitangi, so this is on the treaty grounds a number of years ago. And one of the things that we continue to say is that in terms of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi as it's been translated as, a key focus is actually on the honouring of the treaty. Right? Treaties, Moana Jackson has told us, are made to be honoured. And yet, often in our context, the focus in terms of the treaty is about resolving or settling rather than honouring. And there's a really significant difference. So he would say, in terms of our treaty settlement process that many of our people have worked their way through, but at the end of the day, if we're talking about sovereignty and we're talking about being self-determining, and we're talking about what we would call tino rangatiratanga in terms of self-determination, that treaties are not made to be settled, treaties are made to be honoured. And so really, in terms of the role of treaties, what we see is that if they are not honoured, and if both partners are not honourable in that relationship, then the treaty does not facilitate change. It can only facilitate change when both partners to a treaty are committed to being honourable and honouring it. So the work that we've been doing around historical and colonial trauma, as I said, whakarau o the tangata, or healing, the healing of people, has been focused on notions of the impact of sexual violence and family violence. I'm focusing a little bit more on family violence in this particular presentation, in terms of the impact on Māori whānau, so extended family, hapu, which is a sub-tribal or clan group, and iwi, which is a tribal group. And the thing around these terms, whānau, hapu, and iwi, when we talk about them as kind of systems of collective relationships and how we relate with each other, they have multiple levels that also connect, again, back to the land. So the word whānau is extended family, and extended family is not a nuclear family model. Okay? It's not a domesticated, colonial, heteronormative model of family. Whānau is extended, so it's a deep model. Some people would say 3 or 4 generations, but it's really whatever you say it is within your whānau. It's as high, it's as deep, and it's as wide as we say. So, which is, you know, when we're looking at issues around the removal of children, and we're looking at issues of violence, and we're looking at issues of connection to land, often the focus we get from our ministries is on family, and it's a nuclear family model, and it's about a certain way of being. It only reaches out so far to siblings. It might include an auntie, uncle, but often doesn't. And so the whole construction of how we think about historical and intergenerational trauma and its impact is not about a nuclear family model. It's about pushing back and redefining those spaces. And so we come from, the work we do is from a kaupapa Māori methodology approach. It's a Māori approach, kaupapa referring to philosophy, policy, ways of being, platform, foundation. So it's very much from a Māori defined way of being. And so for this project, the priorities for this work were developed from Māori healers, from Māori health social workers, from Māori communities, and the knowledge and a desire from them to extend on the knowledge that we have in terms of healing in an intergenerational way, so in a whānau way. And that Māori knowledge, culture and language is a critical component or a core component to the overall research methodologies that we use and the methods that we use, so how we do things. And they're but that's based on Graham Smith's 6 principles of kaupapa Māori theory, and which is also talked about in Linda Smith's work on decolonising methodologies. And those 6 principles are they're kind of overarching principles that we drop down in terms of specific detail. So one is rangatiratanga. Rangatiratanga is about sovereignty, it's about self-determination. So at the very core of the work we do is our ongoing aspiration handed to us from our ancestors, and something that we continue to advocate for and to seek is Māori, whānau hapa iwi, as sovereign, as self-determining, as having control over our lives and gaining control over our territories and what happens in our territories. Whānau, as I said, is an extended family structure principle, so we're not focused on nuclear family models. Nuclear family models do not work for us as Indigenous people. Nuclear family models means that child, youth and family can say that they can't find a family member to take a child and therefore they place them with others. That's what nuclear family models do to us. Because if you don't know the extended model, you never know who to go to. If you're only going to what you consider to be, this kind of model of what a family looks like, then you don't have the capacity or the Indigenous knowledge of those systems to go beyond. So actually the nuclear family model was imposed very early on our people. It was about the individualisation of our people through individualisation of land title, individualisation through education, a whole reconstruction of our relationships in a way that was very detrimental and enabled the dismantling and the destruction of many of our collective relationships. And so what we're doing in this system is we're rebuilding those. We're rebuilding those relationships. Ako, which is the term we use for both learning and teaching. It's the term that covers learning, teachers. Kaiako is a teacher. Akonga is a student. So ako is the term that sits in the middle in terms of culturally defined pedagogies. And inside there are various relationships that we have with each other that kind of determine how we work together in terms of knowledge and learning and teaching. And so that's really central to a lot of the work we do. Taonga tuku iho, Graham referred to as a cultural aspirations principle. But in fact, taonga is a word for all things that we treasure, both tangible and intangible. Everything that our ancestors have gifted us is a taonga, both in terms of physical, in terms of land, in terms of physical carvings, those kinds of things, those cultural taonga, but also the intangible things. So taonga is our language, taonga is our ceremony, taonga is our culture. So, he's really worked to shape these principles in a very broad way so that we can refer to all of those ancestral gifts, because tuku iho means to be given, to be passed down. So these are treasures passed down from our ancestors that we are now responsible for being guardians of, in order to continue to pass them down. Kia piki aki ngā rarerare o te kāinga, and this is a phrase that refers to a socio-economic, what he calls a socio-economic mediation principle, but kia piki aki is to uplift. So it's like economic intervention. It's to uplift the issues that are experienced in our villages or in our homes. So what are the support systems we need to put in place to support transformation and to uplift and to support our people who are experiencing a range of, oppressive systems around economics, for one. So how do we work collectively to mediate those things? And kaupapa, as I said, around kaupapa Māori is around philosophy, it's around grounding, it's foundation, it's a collective philosophy principle, and often, a lot of what we do is driven by that we have a kaupapa that we're all committed to, this issue, or we're all committed to this change, and it brings people together. And this is our research whānau, and of this whānau, I'm the only one that is university-based. Miriana, Ngarope and Dihi, who lead the community teams, are all engaged in community provider work and community social service, Māori community, iwi, tribal community. And so our whānau was very much a community-based research project, and I provided the support for that. And the methods we used, again, are very Māori methods. So whanaungatanga is really about building relationships. So I said whānau is about extended family. Whanaunga is a relation. So when we talk about each other as being a whanaunga, we're talking about each other as being a relation. When we're talking about whanaungatanga, it's the process of being a relation. So it's the forming and the building and the supporting of relationships. So the word whānau is really central to how we do everything, because it tells us that we need to always be in relationship, and to not take those relationships for granted. That whanaungatanga means it's an ongoing building and supporting of relationships. Whakawhiti kōrero, and I refer to it here as kind of talking story, having conversations. Whakawhiti is to go back and forth, and kōrero is to talk. So there was a kind of area, which I'll talk about in a minute, of things that we all wanted to talk about as communities, but we didn't want to get caught up in this kind of linear interview process of an individual interview. We wanted meaningful conversations to take place, and we did that through hui, which are collective Māori gatherings. So, often people would say, oh, so you mean you did interviews in a focus group? Because that's easy for people to understand. But actually, we didn't do interviews in big focus groups, because there are cultural ways of relating that come with these. So in whakawhiti kōrero, the way that we have conversations are determined by the relationships that we have, the cultural relationships that we have. So elders have a particular role in that, facilitating that discussion. And younger people have a particular role in being engaged in that discussion. And everyone in between, and then your relationships with each other, if you're elder siblings, younger siblings, all those things come to play in terms of how you have these conversations. And there are cultural ceremony and there's cultural ways of being that shape that. Similarly with hui, having Māori, these gatherings have particular cultural requirements that come with them. So they will always have knowledge holders, elders, kaumātua kuia karaua, our elders that will open these hui and will be a part of facilitating how they move forward. So it's not, interviews and focus groups are actually really easy to do. We can do those really easily. But if we want to be doing meaningful work as Indigenous communities together, and which I include myself in my own communities, we have protocols and tikanga traditions and ways of doing things that are really important to us, that take precedence over the content of the work. One of the things around when people talk about decolonising methodologies or Indigenous research methodologies is, we can't privilege the idea of a research outcome over the relationships and processes that we have, because that is not how we operate. So in terms of things like historical trauma, these were some of the things that as a collective of communities that people talked about that they wanted to focus on. One was on tikanga. So what are the cultural practices in terms of healthy relationships? So rather than focusing on what was wrong with us from the beginning, we focused on what is right with us. So what were the healthy relationships that we had that preceded a colonial experience? So it's going beyond that period of colonialism and thinking about what do our practices and protocols tell us that we did and that our ancestors did and that they gifted to us. So what were healthy relationships? What were the ceremonies? And then people, what came from that was, well, so what are the particular Māori concepts that inform us? What are the whakatauki, the ancestral sayings, the proverbial sayings that help us to understand what a healthy relationship means? Because so often in the area of family violence and sexual violence, prevention, intervention, research, the focus goes immediately on what is wrong with us. What is wrong, as if we are the problem. And what our people have said continually through all of our work is that we are not the problem, we are the solution. And in order to be the solution, we have to understand what a healthy relationship was that preceded this experience we had that removed some of that knowledge from our day-to-day living. So, and we have them in stories in pūrākau, and stories about the land, and stories about relationships, and stories about our ancestors, and that every pūrākau is both a learning and a teaching and a guide, and gives us guidance, like ancestral proverbial sayings, whakatauki, gives us guidance in how to live our lives, gives us an indication of what our ancestors expected us to do, what our obligations and responsibilities to each other are, and it really lays out a whole range of ways of doing that. And then we wanted to know, so how did that change? What were the changes in terms of healthy relationships? How did that change? And understanding what the impact was in terms of colonialism in particular as an overarching historical trauma event that played itself out differently in different territories, because that is the case. So where I'm from, in Waikato, was the first site of the very first war over land, right? But it played itself out in other ways. So 45 minutes down the road in Pariaka was invaded by 1,500 militia, and all of the men were arrested, put in chains, and put in ships to the bottom of the South Island. So the ways in which these experiences happened were not all the same, but the overarching intent of colonialism was. And so how were those relationships changed and impacted? How were our ways of living together and fulfilling our protocols and fulfilling our relationships impacted on by those events? And how did and have our tupuna, our ancestors, responded to and sought to address those changes? And that also comes in many ways. It comes in acts of resistance, it comes in acts of fighting back, it comes in acts of removing our people from the context. There's a whole lot of ways in which our ancestors responded to and found ways of seeking to ensure the well-being of future generations. And they weren't all the same. And then we came into the notion of the impact of sexual violence in terms of Māori communities. And so people started to talk then about how has this form of violence entered into our communities? Because when we look at what a healthy relationship was prior to colonisation and in earlier colonial records, sexual violence did not occur in Māori whānau. And if it ever occurred, it was very rare. So rare that you could name it, and you could name the event, and you could say the background of that event. But it was not a prevalent experience in our communities in the way that it is now. So how did it enter into our communities, and what has been the impact of that, both in terms of when it entered and then the intergenerational impact? So, the way in which we understand the entering of this form of violence into our communities is in a particular way. And so the communities that we're working with wanted to get a deeper understanding of that impact and how it entered. And what changed in terms of the ways in which our systems were changed and our whānau were changed. And nuclearisation and domestication of family is one really key change. Really key, significant change, and I'll come back to that. Then, because we don't want to leave it there, because that's where a lot of things are left, right? That sexual violence is prevalent and you have a problem. Actually, we wanted to go further and say, so how do we return back to a context where it wasn't prevalent? What are the things we need to do to get to move back into healthier relationships? And that is both in terms of our own whānau and our own communities, but it's also in terms of systems and structures, because colonisation is not a one-off event. It's an ongoing series of structures, and it's an ongoing system that continues to perpetuate today. So what are the things we need to do in terms of intervention in those systems, interventions, and what are some of the cultural concepts that can help inform us and help us to remember the healthy relationships that were a part of the experience of our ancestors and that they want us to return to. I mean, that's the thing about working with the communities that we're working with. They are really clear. This is not the life our ancestors laid out for us. This is not how our ancestors choose for us to be now. And so they want us to help find the ways to shift the structures, to change the systems, and to return to a way of being well. And actually, that return will benefit all people living on our land. It will benefit everybody if we can return to notions of what are healthy relationships. And a number of years ago, a Māori task force on whānau violence, led by Tamati Kruger and a whole range, including some of the people that were in this work, said really clearly that if we continue to think that interventions in family violence and sexual violence can be determined by Western Pākehā approaches, then we're in trouble. That we have to stop assuming that the imported approaches to these things that criminalise, that isolate, that pathologise Māori as being the problem, that, you know, if we enable that to continue, we are not going to see any change. And we've had these explanations, as we know, for 100 years. And they haven't taken us anywhere. In fact, we've seen an increase in prevalence. So we're really clear that, you know, you've imported all these ways of thinking about violence and you've imposed them on our communities, and the impact of that has been increased prevalence, increased criminalisation, increased incarceration, increased pathologising. So actually it's time for us to do our thing now. We want to go back into a self-determining space, and we want to determine these things ourselves. And so we've really drawn on a lot of historical trauma work that's come out of Native American communities that are looking at historical and colonial trauma, that have come out of ideas of the impact of colonisation as a soul wound on our people that has been intergenerationally, you know, we have an intergenerational experience of wounding of our people, which comes from people like Eduardo and Bonnie and Eduardo Duran and their book around Indigenous psychologies. And Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and people that she's worked with talk about historical trauma as the cumulative emotional psychological wounding over a lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma impact. So we're talking about the collective impact of these events on our peoples, on entire groups of peoples, in the way in which they impact. And Tessa Evans-Campbell, who's also works at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute in Seattle and School of Social Work in Seattle, talked about three distinguishing features. One is that these events are widespread and that entire communities, entire collectives are impacted on by these historical or colonial events, these traumatic events. Two, that they generate high levels of collective distress and mourning that continues into contemporary communities. And three, that they are generally purposely perpetuated by outsiders with a destructive intent. And the purposely perpetuated is really critical to understand. These are not events that happen by accident. These are not environmental events, you know, that happen from earthquakes. You know, we know those environmental or floods. These are traumatic, collectively impacted events that have been deliberately imposed by one group of people on another. And so there's an intention about the impact, and there's an intention about the outcome of those events. And Karina Walters talks about historical trauma in terms of it manifesting and also being known in other terms for Indigenous nations as colonial trauma. So colonisation and its many impacts, collective impacts, is itself a traumatic event. And then in our country, someone else who I don't have her work here, but it's Judith Atkinson's work that she has done here in terms of trauma trials that we've been looking at for this new work that we're doing at the moment. And it's similar. It's a similar notion of that kind of collective colonial impact on communities that have an intent of destruction of communities, and how that manifests itself in terms of violence that is then becomes an intergenerational experience of Indigenous nations. And at home, Tariana Tūria, who was a Minister of Parliament as a Māori MP, and she talked about the impact of historical trauma, and she had used the term Holocaust in relation. Holocaust and genocide are words that we're not meant to use in Aotearoa. We're continually told that didn't happen. And so we did, when Tariana used the word Holocaust in terms of colonisation and traumatic events, there was a huge uproar in our country in terms of her using that word. But what's really, a lot of this work is also documented in terms of the intergenerational experience of Holocaust survivors. So this is, when we are looking at historical trauma, there's also in a lot of the international literature a connection across to Holocaust survivors, to the impact of Japanese people that were interned in concentration camps in Turtle Island or in the States and in other countries, and that, the intention of that is the same. And actually, if we understand the history of the removal of Native American people from their homelands and the Trail of Tears and the removal and relocation of Native people, the forced relocation of Native people in 1835, in terms of the Andrew Jackson period of their history, in that period of time, there's really clear evidence that Hitler studied that to get some ways of doing that in terms of what happened in the Holocaust. So these things are not disconnected. And one of the things around what we're talking about history today is how do we connect these things? How do we understand what happened across countries, what's happened across collectives of people, and the impact of things like colonisation, the Holocaustic impact in terms of Nazi Germany being informed by actions that happened to Native American people. And then all of that being informed by, all of our countries in colonial contexts informing each other about how to work with Native people or Indigenous people. So, the whole thing around knowing our history and our connections is really important. And for us, working across Indigenous nations who are also looking for healing in these contexts, we have a lot to share with each other in terms of our experiences. And this is the Waitangi Tribunal, which is the tribunal that oversees the breaches of Te Tere Tio Waitangi, and this tribunal report in 1996 was relative to my own tribal area, so the Taranaki history, and they referred to that as the Holocaust. So, where some people don't want that term used, the fundamental underpinning understandings of genocide, of ethnocide, of those things are applicable and have been applied to our context. So then when we look at notions, so understanding that history has been really important. So when we think about notions of then defining violence, and in this case, defining the impact of sexual violence in terms of our people, a lot of what we asked our people in terms of what is a healthy relationship and then how has that changed has been about thinking about violence and how we understand it as Indigenous nations. How we think about the impact of something like sexual violence and how we consider it. So for our people, it's been very clear that when we talk about both family violence and sexual violence, we must see it in the context of political, social, cultural, and spiritual understandings and explanations. So we can't talk about the impact of contemporary family violence and sexual violence without talking about the historical context, without talking about the political context, without talking about the impact culturally, without talking about the impact spiritually. So I just pulled a couple of examples of that from Māori women that work in the field, lawyers and academics. So in terms of the defining, Annette Sykes, who's a Māori lawyer, activist, really active in the treaty space particularly, in '96 she talked about sexual violence and that this is also applicable in terms of generally in terms of family violence. It's not only about being a crime against the individual person, but as an attack on the person's entire being and mana. So mana is like your integrity, your dignity, your status, your position, your essence of yourself. Everyone has mana. Everyone's born with mana. And so when someone is violent towards you, they are transgressing your mana. They are degrading and demeaning your mana. And mana is everything. Mana is just not, it's not about a physical transgression, it's about a physical, it's about a spiritual, it's about a cultural transgression. And it's also about when you transgress the mana of one person, you transgress the mana of all their ancestors that came before them and all their ancestors yet to come. Because mana is passed through whakapapa. It's passed through our ancestral, spiritual, ancestral, cultural lineage. So for someone to transgress the mana of one person, it's never only an individual. You transgress all of their ancestral links and all of their ancestors that are yet to come. So Ani Makaire talks about the instances of abuse against women and children have always been regarded as whānau concerns, and that whānau action, so collective, it's a collective concern and collective actions must be taken because it's a collective impact. So family violence and sexual violence is not ever, and this is not to deny a need for people to have their own healing as individuals. This is not to deny that. It's not to say that we don't care about that or we don't find pathways for healing, but it's to say that we have to heal the entire collective around them. So, in thinking about violence, this is another example. So a person was not to believe to exist as an individual, but was linked through their whakapapa, their genealogical ancestral connections, to their whānau hapu iwi and their broader ecosystem, so both human and non-human ecosystems. A slight or an attack on one member of a hapu or sub-tribal group could therefore be considered an attack on the whole hapu. And collective retaliation might be considered warranted. So this is people reflecting on what are the intervention and prevention ways of thinking that our ancestors had, and what were the actions that could be taken in terms of transgression of mana. On other occasions, the whānau or hapu of the offender might be expected to impose their own sanctions on their own. So when we look at collective ways of dealing with issues of violence, it's not only about the person who has experienced that violence, but it's also about what people call the perpetrator. So when we think about the idea of Māori as perpetrator, because it's not only Māori that perpetrate these, and we need to be really clear that actually a lot of people that perpetrate violence against Indigenous people are not Indigenous. But in the context of our own, what we say is that actually the whole whānau must also deal with the person who is actually the perpetrator of the violence. So both, for everyone, it's about collective, trying to change the collective. When we do that, we can change intergenerational experiences. So if we're only going to engage only with individuals, we're not healing collectives, and we're not healing, creating a pathway for intergenerational healing. So there are many practices that we had in place culturally, ancestrally, historically, that gave us ways of dealing with transgressions, all kinds of transgressions. Not just the most severe violence, but a whole range of violences or transgressions against mana. So when we were looking at what are the disruptions, so we have these ways of thinking, we have these ways of doing, we have these ways of understanding, practices, tikanga. So the word tikanga comes from the word tika, which is to do things correctly or in a good way or in the right way. So tikanga is a word we use for protocols, for practices, for ways of being. So it's really grounded on doing things in a correct way. And it gives us a whole range of ways of thinking about ourselves. But when we talk about historical trauma, colonial trauma, in terms of disruptions to tikanga, these are the kinds of things that our communities talked about. Invasion. Acts of invasion disrupted our ability to do things in the right way, disrupted our ability to do our own practices, protocols and ceremonies, and to be a part of doing things the way that our ancestors desired and aspired for us. Alcohol. Alcohol flooded our country very early on, particularly from the north, deliberately so, deliberately flooded our country. And a part of the Treaty of Waitangi, the development of that in 1840, was actually a way that our people saw that the colonial settlers that were coming could manage the alcohol and the behaviour that came with early settlers. So in the treaty we have Tino Rangatiratanga, which is about sovereignty, which was held by Māori, by tribal groups, by hapu and iwi. And on the other side we had Kāwanatanga, which was about governance, and about forming a governance to actually deal with some of these issues that were arising from the arrival of others. And, when we think about the treaty relationship in 1814, our people way outnumbered Pākehā people. But our ancestors also saw that these changes were happening and somehow they needed to have some form of governance to deal with them because they were really significant. Alcohol was a significant impact. Muskets, the arrival of muskets, which interrupted tribal relationships. So relationships that we had and the disagreements that we had that were more in kind of hand-to-hand and often close battle got totally changed with muskets where you could engage in warfare with muskets from a distance. And so when we talk about ideas of mana and how mana was transgressed, our ancestors would remember those in stories and there would become times where they would be rebalanced and muskets became a tool once they became imported into our country, and they changed a whole lot of dynamics. Christianity, which came hand in hand with civilization. So assimilation, Christianization, civilizing, all those things of taking the natives and ensuring their barbaric habits and we refer to in terms of being in a form of communism. So all of these things that were considered to be barbaric had to be removed and shifted and assimilated into a particular way of being. And raupatu. So raupatu is one of the terms we use for land confiscation, for the taking of land. So our people will talk about a raupatu or they'll talk about muru me te raupatu. And raupatu actually means 100 beatings. So that's what the taking of our land meant to our ancestors. It meant that we were being continually beaten over and over again. So when we think about that's the relationship to land that we had, that's the relationship to country, and that's the impact that our ancestors saw by naming it that. It shows the connectedness to land and what happened when it was removed. And inside of those things were the colonial belief systems and practices, the denial of tikanga, the denial of protocols and practices, ways of being, the denial of te reo, which is the denial of Māori language, the degradation of our structures, because once you, with individualization and the imposition of nuclear family undermined the extended family structure, it meant that the roles, the obligations, the responsibilities, the accountabilities, the way that we related to each other became fragmented. And individualization, the kind of the liberal South individual who is self-determining and doesn't have to have any responsibility or control or relationship with anyone else or be accountable to anyone else, is really an underpinning of a kind of nuclear family model and of the new manifestation of colonisation through neoliberalism, which maintains and retains that kind of belief system. So how do we move from just being individuals who have no relation, are not relational and not accountable and caring and responsible to each other, how do we move that back? Because that's a key, in our view, for healing, is to move back to systems of collective responsibility. That's not to deny that we're individuals. We know that we're individuals, but we're individuals inside collective relationships. So we all have relationships. Colonial ideologies of gender are really significant. The ways in which gender was imposed, the idea of the patriarchal home, the idea of the male head of the house, the head of the castle, women being gendered roles in terms of colonial roles. Those impacts have been very significant, and they play out every day in family violence and sexual violence contexts, because those contexts are enabled by this kind of heteronormative patriarchal way of thinking, this way of what men are meant to be and what women are meant to be, and who has control and who is in charge, which really moved away from the collective responsibilities that we had as Indigenous people and the way in which we saw our own roles, which I'll come to in a minute, as wahine, so as the female essence, and tani, the male essence. So we had both complementary and separate roles, but they weren't power over roles. They came with colonialism. And they certainly weren't the kind of roles where you locked two people up with a whole lot of children in one house and just left them there to fend for themselves, which in itself is a really unhealthy way of being. It's really unhealthy, just like schools are really unhealthy. Where else would you go and drop your child with one adult and there's 30 others and you'd be okay with it? And think, oh, my kid's going to be well, my child's going to be really well looked after in this context. I mean, we certainly don't do it up the road, go up the road to a friend's house, see they've got 30 children and just see them and go, oh, well, this will be fine. Most people don't do that, But also having one adult with big groups of children, it's just, there's no collective responsibility inside that and collective well-being. And urbanisation, which came as a direct result. People talk about the urban drift. There was no urban drift in our country. No one drifted by just having to drift to the main centres, just like our people never drifted through the Pacific. The urbanisation was actually a part of a kind of calculated system of industrialisation, of having to go somewhere for work, having to earn. There are pocket areas of employment, more likely in cities. And the consequence of that, if you can't afford to go to your homeland, you can't afford to go home, the disconnection of raising children in the city, and you can't get them back to their land, all those things we know are really significant. So, the key that, going through all of this was really getting to this part. So how do we create some healing, drawing on traditional knowledge, drawing on ancestral ways of being, drawing on what our ancestors told us were healthy relationships, how do we then kind of construct some healing pathways in a contemporary way? So whānau and whanaungatanga, which I talked about, we end up back in that position. We end up back in collective ways of living, collective ways of being. And, you know, we have to really decolonise, and not just us as Indigenous people, everyone. Because we've all bought into this idea that we have a nice nuclear, domesticated family unit in our own little house with our own little car and our own little TV that multiplies many, many times in the community, you know, and that is actually the fundamental underpinning of capitalism. You know, we've all bought into this. So there's a need for major decolonisation in terms of the systems that we are a part of. And so how do we return to extended family, excuse the spelling, but extended family relationships? How do we return to whanaungatanga that is about collective relationships of caring for each other and being accountable? Whakapapa, how do we reconnect our people to their ancestral lineage, to knowing their ancestors, to knowing their territory, to knowing their country, you know, and also to being able to have the ability to walk on their own land? A real reconnection through whakapapa. So for us, what that ancestral lineage and that knowledge does in terms of whakapapa, in terms of those relationships, those ancestral relationships. And the word whakapapa means is to lay layers. So we're talking, you know, ancestry and lineage, cultural templates of genealogy for us are about layers. They're not this kind of 2x2 thing that must have been constructed through the idea of Noah's Ark, that everyone came 2x2. It's not this tidy, heterosexual, 2 parents, then 2 children, and, you know. That's actually not what whakapapa or cultural ancestral lineage is for us. It's about, the word tells us, it's about layers. It's about layers that go wide and layers that go deep. And when you visualize that, you see something very different that moves us away from a nuclear model. So we kept saying to our people, stop drawing your whakapapa like an ethnographic image or an anthropological image, because we try and squeeze into this model and actually we don't fit. That's not how we fit. A return to tikanga, a return to cultural practices and protocols, a return to te reo, a return to language, and the word reo also means voice. So a return to language and giving voice to that. A return to our own ways of thinking about cultural gender relationships that are collective, that are about mana wahine, female essence and status, and manatane, male essence and status. And I say that in terms of essence. I'm not talking about a biological way of being. Okay? I'm not talking about a biology of a man and a biology of a woman. Because actually within our history, we know that we always had takatapui, which is a term used for having an intimate friend of the same sex. So it's a term we're using now in terms of Māori LGBTQI. We know that we've always had diversity of gender relationships and a diversity of sexual identities. So that's not new for us. You know, and some of the debates that happen in terms of gender and sexual identity, I'm like, we don't want to go there because that's actually not how our ancestors thought. So when we talk about mana wahine and manatane, we're not talking about a biological, physical being. We're talking about the ways of being in terms of female essence and male essence and the way in which we do those in our roles. So I come from, in Taranaki where I come from, when the men were removed from Parihaka, from our village, and taken to the South Island, to Otago, where Holly used to live, and they were imprisoned in Otago for a number of years, many of them. Some of them never returned. when they were taken, one of the leaders of Parihaka, Te Whiti o Rongo Mai, said, "Tū tama wahine I te wā o te kore." And tū tama wahine, he was referring to the women that were left. So that I te wā o te kore was in the time when the men have been removed. So what he was saying to all of our women that remained is that you will do all of the roles that are required for the well-being of this community, this collective community. So it was around roles. It was around, it wasn't about can women do it or not do it. It was about there's an expectation that you will continue the well-being of this community. Tū tama wahine I te wā o te kore. And that is something that's really stuck and been a part of how I think about it, and how Ngāropi, who worked on this project, her organisation is called Tū Tama Wahine. And that was named by, one of our elders, or some of our elders gave the name to that organisation, which is a family violence, prevention and intervention organisation. And they consider themselves to be a liberation organisation. And they are Tū Tama Wahine. So these things around cultural gender relations means that we've got to step outside the colonial gender relations about who we are and what we do, and think about it in our own terms. Papa kāinga. Kāinga is home, or a place that you call home. And papa kāinga is collective communal living. So something that keeps coming up regularly in this work is that if we want to be collectively accountable to each other, we need to start thinking about intergenerational homes, intergenerational living, collective living, papa kāinga. Because papa kāinga provide these spaces where we were all accountable to each other. And we would talk to each other, and we would support each other, and we would call out bad behaviour. And we would support good behaviour, healthy relationships. So I return to papa kāinga. So what does that mean? It means being intergenerational in our homes, and particularly the relationship of the grandparent generation to the tupuna grandparent generation to the mokopuna, the grandchild generation. And by grandparents, I don't mean a biological grandparent. I mean all the grandparents and all the aunties and uncles and grand aunties and uncles that raised all of the children of communities. Because actually, our children were not raised all the time historically by parents. This notion of parents raising children is a relatively new phenomenon, because they had other work they needed to do physically in terms of the well-being of whānau. So often children were raised in collective ways and raised in that relationship. And so when we talk about papa kāinga, we are talking about those intergenerational relationships. And we would think about in terms of, we have sayings around mokopuna and tupuna. So mokopuna, the grandchild, moko is that, these images I have are moko on my arms and on my face, moko kauai, a chin, moko. So mokopuna is like, and puna is like a spring or a fountain. So the grandchild is the reflection of the spring, and the spring is the tupuna, the grandparent generation, the ancestor generation, and the ancestors, which again, tu means to stand, and puna is a spring. So our grandchildren are the reflection of our ancestors and the reflection of their grandparents. So it's a particular relationship that you can't get in nuclear family living. You can only really get the essence of that by ensuring that there is intergenerational links, time with elders, time with grandparents, the grandparent-grandchild relationship. And I have 5 grandchildren, and I really know now what that means in terms of their well-being. And my son and his partner and I chose to live together in an intergenerational home so that we could support each other and I could support them, and that my mokopuna, at least 2 of them that I live with, would have time with me. And then his partner, her family lived 5 minutes up the road. So she, my grandchildren have these other grandparents, and they have great-grandparents that live. So we're all in the we're really close to each other. And then my other son in Wellington and his partner, and the Wellington area is also tribal, Taranaki tribal land, Te Atiawa tribal land that we're from. They live around the corner from her parents, and her grandfather lives up the road. So I'm really, I feel deeply privileged, honoured for my life that our grandchildren, my grandchildren, have these relationships with 2 or 3 generations that inform their well-being and that support them. Whenua is land, and we talked about the connection to land. Whenua is also the word for placenta. So whenua has always been known to feed us, to sustain us, to help us grow. So when we talk about whenua in terms of land, we also talk about whenua in terms of placenta, that which nurtures the child. So all of these things are interrelated. And so, it just, as we work through this work, it just becomes clearer and clearer to us that there are these reconnections that we must do for the well-being of our people. The rongoa is a return to traditional medicines, and so and the work that we're doing at the moment, one of the organisations that we're working with, their view was they wanted to be involved in this family violence work, but they didn't want to be involved in anything that was about social workers and counsellors. So in the very first gathering we had, don't ask us to look at social workers. We're not going to look at social workers and counsellors. We want to look at self-healing processes. So that's not to deny that some people need to talk and all those things, but their focus was on traditional healing, their focus was on return to land, their focus was on healing practices of going to the ocean, which is something that they had always done, those kinds of things. Karakia and wairuatanga, spirituality, and karakia as blessings, karakia as incantations, karakia as ways of making us safe, as clearing spaces, of removing sacredness from spaces so we can move in and out, and of putting sacredness in other spaces that need to be made and protected in terms of their role and in terms of the place. So karakia and spirituality. And the spirituality, the wairuatanga, kept bringing us back to what is historical trauma. What is it in terms of violence, and to the work again of Bonnie Duran and Eduardo Duran that kept reminding us that these are soul wounds that need to be deeply healed on a spiritual level as well as all the other levels. But we must focus spirituality back into our lives in order to heal those wounds, and that we have a responsibility in this generation, when we're thinking about healing, to try to bring in as much of this healing into our lives, healing ourselves, healing our whānau, healing our people, so that we don't pass it to the next generation. That is a part of our obligation now, and it's something that our ancestors are calling on us to do now, and it's become very clear in all the work we do, that this generation must make really significant changes to ensure that those soul wounds, that those painful ancestral memories are not passed on, but the ancestral knowledge and memories that we carry that give us life, that they are passed on. So, kia ora koutou. Kia ora. I think we're over time, is that right?
I'm going to hold this microphone up. We were going to have a breakout of some conversation with Leonie afterwards, but we've actually exhausted that, I think, today. Thank you so much for this corridor, Leonie. But I'm very happy to invite a couple of questions from the floor. Is that okay?
Yep.
Would anyone like to ask a question? Comments? Yes. I just give you the mic. Do you want to come up and is there all? I'm only giving that to you because it won't be recorded afterwards. I probably should have said that to you. Okay. Is it recorded? Yes.
Hello, Leonie. I don't know if this is working.
Yeah.
Thank you for today, and thank you so much for coming over here, and it's really lovely to meet you. My name's Carissa. I work in student equity here at the university. I was really interested to hear your thoughts around the heteronormative implications of colonialism and how that's impacted your peoples, and if you can explain what the pushback on that has been, and if there is some talk of getting back to the traditional ways and traditional thoughts around, you know, genders and what the ancestors used to do when it came to accepting people for who they are.
Yeah, there's definitely. Oh, I'm good.
Oh, you've got it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of work around decolonising that space and about a return to really to whānau. Because I think in the notion of whānau and that extended family way of being, that is an inclusive space. And so when we're thinking about gender relations and we're thinking about mana, we're thinking about mana wahine and mana tāne, we are thinking about an inclusive space. And so when I talk about the term takatapui as a intimate friend of the same sex, and so, you know, that can be, that can mean a range of things, but it definitely has become a way of thinking about how the impact of colonial ideas of gender have undermined a lot of that. And so when we think about that intimate relationship, it can be both about a friendship relationship, it can also be a sexual relationship. So whatever intimacy means to you. And so we do have those frames that talk about relationships that are not based in a kind of heterosexual idea of what a relationship looks like. But I think too that the imposition, you know, the nuclear family model has created this context of how we think we're meant to be, and actually how we were forced to be for many, you know, we've been forced to be for many generations. Yeah, and so the other thing around, because we're doing some work with another community organisation, Te Whāriki Takapau, which they do a lot of sexual reproductive health work. And so we're working with Alison Green from there and other people who work in her organisation on a project called Honour Project Aotearoa. And it's a project that's based on the work of Karina Walters in Seattle, which was the Honour Project, which looked at the well-being of Two-Spirit people, Native American people. And so we're reproducing that work with Alison at home and thinking around the well-being of takatapui, the well-being of Māori LGBTQI communities and their whānau. And a part of that is actually talking back to our own people around decolonising how we think about gender, decolonising how we think about sexuality, you know, thinking about how we relate to each other and what relationships look like. And a part of that is really understanding that in the language, in the Māori language, we don't have a word for any of these relationships. We don't have a word for heterosexual or straight, and we don't have a word for lesbian or gay. We don't have a word for any of these because actually relationships were accepted in the roles and relationships that were a part of community. And so I think in the past people have said, oh, you don't have a word for gay men or for lesbians, therefore they didn't, or transgender, therefore they didn't exist. Well, actually it's the total opposite. We didn't have words because your sexual identity was not the key factor of your role in whānau. Your role in whānau was about your role as a member of the collective and what you did. And so that wasn't the defining factor. The defining factor was out. And so we're trying to move back to that, where actually we have this diversity in our communities, and we always have. And we've also had expected roles and collectives with each other in our whānau hapu and iwi, and with each other in relationship to each other. So I talked today a little bit about some of those roles are, I am Taina to my older sister. So I'm younger sister to my older sister. but I'm tuakana to my younger sister. So I'm an older sister to my younger sister. But my brother is my tungangi, because he's a brother to a sister. And I am a tuahine to my brother, because I'm a sister of a brother. And that's just on really fun. So, and what comes with those roles are certain obligations. Obligations of brother to sister and sister to brother. Obligations of younger sister to older sister and older sister to younger sister. And in the collective ways of being as whānau, they bring certain roles. And then our ancestors identified certain skills or gifts that we had. And so some people even went outside of that general cultural template of way of relating because our ancestors saw particular gifts and that was their role, you know.
So like teachers or mentors or...
Spiritual healers, matakite, which is a word for mata is like your face, kite is to see. So matakite is a person that has sight. And we have all of these gifts that we know. And so, yeah, so I mean, and when we think about it in that terms, we really see the depth that the kind of colonial belief systems around what family is and what gender is, the depth that they have impacted. And so we're really trying to work, and there's a lot of really great work being done around coming back and saying, actually, that's not ours, that's come from somewhere else. We need to rethink that in a contemporary way, because we're living in a contemporary world. So how does our history and our knowledge and our ancestors and our tikanga, our practices and our language, how do we now bring that into this space, this new world, and think about its contribution? But we definitely know that if we keep operating in a nuclear model that's very gendered and very colonial, we're not going to get the healing pathways that we need. Yeah.
Really insightful. Thank you.
Yeah, kia ora.